On today's episode of Women That Kill, we look at Guadalupe Martínez de Bejarano, known by the name that translates from Spanish as the Executioner Woman. She had no known accomplice. The crimes took place in Mexico City between 1887 and 1892, inside the walls of her own home. Very little is known about Guadalupe Martínez de Bejarano's early life. History has not preserved her birth date, her origins, or much about her private world. What we do know is that she was married to a man named Bejarano and had at least one son, a boy named A.W. Bejarano Martínez. By the time her crimes came to light, she was a widow living in Mexico City. We also know that she was not poor. Based on her lifestyle, her home, and her ability to employ servants, Guadalupe belonged to the middle, or upper middle class of Mexican society. And that social position, that respectability, was precisely what made her so dangerous. To truly understand this crime, you have to understand Mexico City in the final decades of the 19th century. This was the era of President Porfirio Diaz, a period in Mexican history known as the Porfiriato. On the surface, it looked like progress. Mexico City was modernizing rapidly. Gas lamps lined the streets. Grand European-style architecture was rising across the capital. Foreign investment was pouring in. The elite were prospering in ways that felt almost dizzying compared to the instability of previous decades. But beneath that gleaming surface, inequality was deepening at a staggering rate. The Porfiriato created enormous wealth for a small class of landowners, businessmen, and government allies, while grinding poverty into the bones of everyone else. Rural communities were being displaced. Indigenous peoples were losing their land. Thousands of poor families flooded into Mexico City, looking for work, for survival, for any foothold they could find. For poor girls and young women in particular, domestic service was one of the only options available. Working as a servant in a wealthy household meant a roof over your head, meals, and a small wage. It meant survival. Families sent their daughters into service out of desperation, trusting that a respectable household would keep them safe. That trust is exactly what Guadalupe Martínez de Bejarano exploited. Guadalupe's method was calculated and predatory. She would seek out young, poor, vulnerable girls, often without strong family connections, and offer them employment as domestic servants in her home. It was an offer that was almost impossible to refuse. A job, a home, safety. But once those girls entered her house, the reality was something else entirely. According to accounts from the investigation, Guadalupe enslaved the girls she brought into her home, subjecting them to prolonged torture that had a disturbing, sadistic quality. The abuse was systematic and extended over weeks, sometimes months. These were not outbursts of anger. They were something far more deliberate and far more disturbing. The crimes came to light through one of the most heartbreaking details in the case. On April 14th, 1891, Guadalupe's son, Aurelio, arrived at the hospital of San Andres in Mexico City and requested a bed for a sick girl he was bringing in for treatment. The girl's name was Crescencia Pineda. She was young, perhaps no older than 12, though her exact age was unknown even to herself. A detail that speaks volumes about how invisible these children were to the society around them. Crescencia was described as a child born outside of marriage, with no official record and no one advocating for her. The hospital staff received her. What they saw when they examined her body told a story that no explanation could cover. Crescencia Pineda and her sister had been in Guadalupe's care. The Pineda sisters, along with at least one other young girl, had been subjected to prolonged abuse inside that house. By the time authorities intervened, it was too late for the sisters. They were dead. When police arrived, Guadalupe had her explanation ready. The burns and scalds found on Crescencia's body, the girl had accidentally overturned a pot of boiling beans on herself. The deaths? Illness? Neglect, perhaps, but not intent. She was a busy woman, she said, Her son Aurelio had been sick with typhus. She couldn't be expected to manage everything at once. The police did not believe her, and neither did the public. What ultimately destroyed Guadalupe Martínez de Bejarano's defense was the one person she may have thought would protect her own son. Aurelio Bejarano, the same young man who had carried Crescencia Pineda to the hospital, eventually identified his mother as the person responsible for the kidnappings, the torture, and the deaths of the girls. Whether he came forward out of conscience, fear, or pressure from investigators, his testimony was devastating. The woman who had built her crimes behind the walls of a respectable home, in a society that deferred to her class and her respectability, was exposed by the person who had lived inside that home with her. At trial, Guadalupe shifted tactics. She blamed Aurelio for everything. The son, she now claimed, was responsible. But the court did not believe her. The evidence, the testimony, and the physical condition of the victims told a story that no amount of deflection could change. The motive behind Guadalupe Martínez de Bejarano's crimes appears to have been rooted in sadism, a desire for control, domination, and the infliction of suffering on those with no power to resist or escape. She did not kill for money, passion, or desperation. She deliberately selected her most vulnerable victims, lured them with the promise of safety, and systematically destroyed them. The social structure of the Porfiriato made this possible. In a society where poor girls were invisible, where class determined whose word carried weight and whose suffering went unrecorded, a woman of Guadalupe's position could operate with a terrifying degree of impunity until the bodies made it impossible to look away. Public outrage over the case was enormous. The nickname La Mujer Verdugo, the executioner woman, spread through Mexico City, and the demand from the public was clear. Death. The crimes were monstrous. The victims were children. The community wanted the severest punishment the law could deliver. What the court delivered instead was a sentence of 10 years and 8 months in prison for the torture and murder of at least 3 young girls. Guadalupe Martínez de Bejarano received less than 11 years. The public was outraged, and history has not been kind to that judgment. Aurelio was sentenced to 2 years in prison for his failure to act in the face of what was happening inside his mother's home. Guadalupe was sent to the bail-in prison for women in Mexico City. And there, the justice that the court had declined to fully deliver was administered in its own way. The other inmates knew who she was and what she had done. She was kept in isolation, separated from the general population for her own safety, because the threat posed by women who knew her crimes was real and constant. She died of natural causes inside Belen prison before she had completed her sentence. She never walked free. Now, at the end of every episode, if I can find the killer's birthday, I take a look at their zodiac sign because it gives us an interesting lens through which to view who they were. Unfortunately, Guadalupe Martínez de Bejarano's birth date has not been preserved in the historical record. She is one of those figures that history recorded in crime, but not in life. We know what she did, but the details of who she was before the crimes remain largely in shadow. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. If you want to learn more about women who killed, check out my playlist. There are plenty more stories waiting for you.